Hello, everybody. Politico magazine has a very interesting piece out today written by Jack Schaefer, the longtime media critic, as well as Tucker Doherty, who is a data reporter. And they collaborated to come up with something like a study of this media clustering effect. Now, what is meant by that? Well, something that I've been thinking about for a while is how national media, especially digital media, which is obviously on the upswing now, tend to cloister themselves. And they don't often do this consciously. They do it by mere dint of simply living in only a handful of places in the country. So just by residing in, say, Manhattan and Washington, D.C., and the surrounding areas, political journalists end up absorbing the atmospherics of what's surrounding them. That's only natural, but it's going to, as a group, bias them against certain, against the ability to detect trends that maybe have their origins elsewhere in the population. So if you happen to be living in Arlington, Virginia, or Astoria, Queens, it's perfectly expected that you're going to end up naturally absorbing the dynamics of the area in which you're living. Now, everybody is susceptible to that. But what this study shows is that increasingly digital media jobs are clustered in areas that are relatively affluent, urban, and coastal. Now, of course, there's a right-wing version of this narrative which basically asserts that the liberal elite are all in the tank for Democrats, and because they're so disconnected from the wants and needs and concerns of ordinary Americans living in the heartland, so they look down on them and sneer at them and call them hicks and blowhards and so forth. And I think that's an oversimplification. I'm not sure if it's a pro-Democrat bias, because as Schaefer notes in this piece, the media actually was fairly tough on Hillary Clinton during the 2016 campaign. Now, there were some problems. I'm saying in totality, it's not as if Hillary was a candidate that they really liked. They simply were just overwhelmingly and seethingly opposed to her opponent. So for example, in 2008, I think it's fair to say that in the primary versus Hillary, in the Democratic primary in 2008, Barack Obama was pretty well favored in the political media class, but that's sort of an aside. What I think this goes to show is that it's really incumbent on journalists and people who at least purport to be professional observers of political trends. It's really incumbent on them to make a conscious effort to change the way that they process information. And it's difficult, and there are no easy answers. And it's probably too much to ask to demand that any individual journalist, uproot themselves and go live somewhere in Kansas when they've made a life in, say, New York or Washington or Los Angeles, and that's just where they're most comfortable residing, and it's where all their professional and social connections are located. But when you look at these things from a wider perspective, it shouldn't be surprising that people who live in these select enclaves develop blind spots as to what is going on elsewhere in the country. So, like I mentioned, this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and it sort of was crystallized for me when I was traveling around the country to cover the 2016 election, and I would be in places like Pensacola, Florida, and I wrote a post on this on Medium at the time. And it occurred to me that this is a pretty thriving city. It's probably conservative in disposition. It is conservative in disposition compared to most cities, but it's nevertheless a city. Plenty of interesting local dynamics there that could be theoretically covered. And yet there's zilch national media in Pensacola, Florida. And why? I mean, it's a low cost of living. Theoretically, digital media was supposed to hold the promise that it could be conducted from anywhere. I mean, the internet supposedly eliminated the physical burdens of producing news, and yet one of the great ironies of these demographic changes is that it seems as though the increasing reliance on internet media, or the prevalence of internet media, has actually hastened the clustering effect and amplified it, such that such that journalism and national digital media, especially, is even more skewed toward New York, Los Angeles, Washington D.C., San Francisco, maybe a smattering of other places. And I think there are ways that could be changed. I mean, it's not going to be hip necessarily, or it's not going to be seen as socially desirable to have your new media outfit located in Pensacola. Although Pensacola, I'm sure, to me, seemed like a perfectly fine place. But I think just changing the geography of media distribution is pretty necessary to have any hope of eliminating these blind spots and to puncture this bubble, which now everybody pretty much seems to agree exists. One of the most telling findings, I think, from this Politico study, which of course I will link to in the description box, is as follows. Schaefer writes, quote, nearly 90% of all internet publishing employees work in a county where Clinton won, and 75% of them work in a county that she won by more than 30 percentage points. So, not many counties voted for Hillary by over 30 percentage points. Some did, but the ones that were really overwhelmingly in favor of Hillary Clinton by that margin tended to be urban, affluent places like west side of Los Angeles, Manhattan, San Francisco, Arlington, Virginia, places like that. Now, of course, there were less affluent places which also voted for Hillary Clinton by huge margins. So that's not to be denied. But at the same time, these places which overwhelmingly lean Democratic and that are affluent tend to be home to the vast lion's share of the nation's media. Now, there was this trend in the campaign last year for media outlets, for like the New Yorker, for example, to dispatch a reporter to one of these deindustrialized places in the Midwest that seemed to be trending toward Trump and ultimately did tip the election overall to Trump. But the problem is, when you just have somebody parachute into Trump land for a couple days or a week or however long, they're sort of like a stranger in a strange land. I mean, they're like a tourist almost on a visit. They don't have any intuition. They don't have any natural intuitions as to the dynamics in those areas. And I count myself among them. I didn't live in Pensacola when I visited. I did spend a number of weeks on the road in these places. But even that really isn't enough to internalize at sort of a deep level how these places formulate their collective political sensibilities. And I think the only real remedy for that, in totality, again, there are always going to be exceptions within this, and some people do a great job. And I tried to do the best that I could individually, but in aggregate, I think that one of the only real way to stem this trend line, or to charter a different course, is for new media to be located in places other than these handful of cities. So why can't you have like a BuzzFeed, for example, located in, I don't know, New Orleans, Cleveland, Missoula, Montana? I mean, maybe that's a stretch, but you get the idea. Why do they have to be in these very cosmopolitan metropolises exclusively? And the Young Turks isn't necessarily immune to this critique either, based in Los Angeles for good reason, but that necessarily limits TYT's ability to be a firm, to be a discerning observer of dynamics elsewhere in the country. And that's actually part of why now this TYT Politics crew has sort of a mandate to travel and to be among voters and Americans who are not necessarily culturally in league with people who might be clustered in an affluent section of Los Angeles. So, I mean, again, there are no easy answers to any of this, but I think Schaefer made a point that is worth absorbing and processing. He says, quote, "Journalism tends toward the autobiographical unless reporters and editors make a determined effort to separate themselves from the frame of their own experiences." Now, what would that determined effort entail? It wouldn't entail, during an election season when there's already a huge upswell of populist sentiment. It wouldn't be sufficient to simply just go out into those areas once every 4 years and try to talk to people in a diner. I mean, that can have some value, but to really make a determined effort, you have to change the way that the journalism industry is constituted. And as now, it seems as though overwhelmingly the trend is for people to simply cluster into a few areas. This notwithstanding the ability that the internet affords to publish from anywhere. And there are all kinds of factors that go into that clustering. Obviously, it's more socially desirable to be in Brooklyn than to be in Wichita. But if there isn't a concerted effort to at least to do something to reverse these trends, I don't see any changes on the horizon. So I will link to this interesting Politico piece. I mean, maybe have some methodological issues with it. It compiles Bureau of Labor labor statistics data, but I mean, I think it's basically on the right track here analytically. And the other thing is, this talks about digital publishing, but when you narrow that spectrum of jobs to political publishing, digital politics media, the clustering effect is even more exaggerated. Then, in that sense, it's overwhelmingly, like probably upwards of 95% New York, D.C., and then a smattering in Los Angeles, smattering in San Francisco, and then maybe a very few elsewhere. So in terms of political media, this dynamic is, I think, even compounded exponentially, and that I think is something to really be cognizant of and try to take steps to remedy. Anyway, that'll do it for now. Let me know what you think. Read this for yourself. I'll also link to my old Medium post on Pensacola, and that'll do it for the time being. So have a great day.